me, huh? Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm Grant Tate, and I'll have to start with a confession that I probably know less than anybody in the room about housing school. Because I'm not in the housing business. I have a small consulting company in Charlottesville. I work with businesses, mostly high tech, try to help them develop strategies and develop people and that sort of thing. So it's been a great learning experience for me, and I've been really impressed with the good work all of you've done in the last few days. Very intense. So the task for today is to try to develop an action plan, or at least some elements of an action plan. And we'd like to capture the elements of the 6 sessions, and some of those elements may not fit precisely in each of the 6 elements. I was impressed by how different ideas or different aspects of the 6 came up as we were talking. But I hope that we could get down to a few items that we can focus on from here. I can say these are some things that we need to develop for the session. It's pretty darn clear that housing is one of our main issues. I've been watching and going through the city council whenever I get a chance. And it's pretty clear from the messages that we're getting from people that housing is one of the big areas of pain in the city, as it is across the country. And so we're doing really important here. And I'd like to say as we go through, I would there are ideas. I hope we'll come up with ideas that may not be that might be outside the scope that you normally think about. And I would suggest that we try to think openly about those and say, may not understand that. And so maybe we can't assign it to anybody specifically, but that's something we need to think about. It was pretty clear, I think, from all the sessions and the conversations we talked about, that there are a lot of people not in the room. And therefore, we're probably missing an important input that we need to really fully understand where we are. But I think that's part of the challenge we have today is to think about that element. And so, just as general ground rules, all ideas are welcome, and we'd like to record those. And as we go along, any suggestions you have for me, please shout out. So let's spend a minute, and I don't, since I'm not in your business, I don't remember all the names. Let's start with Charlene. Tell us your name, and we'll go around the room.
My son is trying to contact me. He's barely awake.
Want me to start on the other side?
No.
My name's solved by that.
Yeah. My name is Charlene Green. I am the manager for the Office of Human Rights for the City of Charlottesville.
Thank you.
My name is Bruce Wardell. I'm a principal at BRW Architects.
Rhoda Stauffer, I manage the housing programs at Park City, Utah.
Michelle Allen, I'm the Inclusionary Housing Program Manager for the City of Boulder, Colorado.
Great.
I wanted you to.
Okay, I'm Kathy Galvin, Charlottesville City Councilor. I am an architect, and I teach neighborhood design and planning at the architecture school.
Good morning, my name is Matt Wallace. I'm the town administrator in Scottsville, a little town about half an hour south of here, previous work in the city and county.
I'm Billy Lehendro, the Historic Preservation Architect at the University of Virginia. I'm here because of being on the Planning Commission.
I'm Gail Marley. I'm on the Planning Commission with the County Scottsville District.
I'm Rachel Vigor. I'm a resident of Carlton Views Apartments, and I'm a planning school dropout.
I'm Rick Randolph. I'm the Scottsville District Supervisor in Albemarle County. I'm Carolyn Rainey, I work for Bank of America, I'm the local market manager.
Okay, thank you.
Susan Christial, I work for Liberty Equipment for Ames.
Brenda Kelly, redevelopment manager for the city.
Nita Morrison, Partners for Economic Solutions, we've been working on the housing needs assessment.
Stacy Pathia, housing program coordinator.
Mark Graham, Director of Community Development for Albemarle County.
Thank you, guys, right there for planning for Alabama.
Alexandra DeBardo, Marketing and Communications Director for the Charlottesville Area Association of Realtors.
Sunshine Mathon, Human Health Alliance.
Ian Vega, Planning District Commission, and Thomas Jefferson Community Land Trust.
Liz Chapman, Griffin Parker Architects.
Chip Boyle for the Thomas Jefferson Planning District.
Keith Smith, Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission, and the board on Thomas Jefferson Community Land Trust.
Sina McGill, I've worked at Region 10, I was the Director of Intensive Services there. I worked for Pacham, being the case manager / everything. I've took some time off to start private business, live in 10th and Page, and thinking of running for city council in a 1.5 years. And am looking also to be on a few local boards like CRHA board. I've been concerned with affordable housing for like the last 17 years.
What do you do in your spare time?
No, I don't work for Region 10 anymore. I work for, I have a 10-year-old daughter and I want, there's a lot going on, and I've worked with a lot of people who were displaced generationally, who's been here for generations, and then found themselves homeless and no family to go to because their family couldn't let them in. So I think I'm bringing a different perspective to the table too. So.
I'm Anna Stuck, I'm the Grants and Communications Manager with Habitat for Humanity, and also an advocate for low-income housing.
Anthony Otto with Townships and Area Coalition for Homeless.
I'm Greg Powell, House Studio Architects. We do a lot of affordable housing. I also chair the Urban Land Institute here locally.
Okay, good. What I thought we would do would be to try to capture 3 top outputs from each of the panels. I realize that boiling down to 3 may be too limiting, but it also might help us create a focus. And I'll happily try to record these in my best writing up here and not on the board. Okay, so let's take needs.
There you are. Okay. Go ahead.
3 outputs.
I apologize, I actually 4.
Okay.
Number 1, need for regional partnership, and these are not in the order of priority.
Say again.
Regional partnership.
Regional partnership. And describe that a little bit more, if you would. That's to pull all the needs together for the region.
Well, it was more about folks all working together. The city is very limited in size and can't annex additional property and pretty much built out. So the city alone can't be addressing and solving the affordable housing needs of the entire region.
Where do we go to find that inventory? Does the city have an inventory of available properties?
Well, the city's working on that, and that's one of my other points also, is that the city's also working on a citywide needs assessment so that the city council can approve and develop a housing strategy.
Needs assessment? Okay.
Needs assessment, leading to developing a housing strategy.
And so the needs assessment, Anita, you're having that. Is that for a point in time, or does it have some projection? All right, great.
Social integration is important. Involve the community and know the people you are serving.
And your second, third point?
And number 4, unfortunately, was probably the most discussed item and hardest one to address. Funding is needed. And I can actually give you an example of part of the discussion we had for that. Someone had mentioned that the solution for homelessness is housing. So who pays for that housing and how is that developed? So that was a big discussion we had. We didn't seem to have a lot of answers. I know there was a lot of direction towards the city needs to come up with funding. So that was pretty much our biggest discussion.
So if you don't mind, I can inject a couple of observations from the outside point of view. What I heard was the whole lifestyle as a theme for this, which is you can't just discuss units, those sorts of things, but what does it mean for a person's whole lifestyle? So if you mind, make a note about that. I guess it comes here. I'm going to call it quality of life. Any other points of this? Yes.
I don't know if this was, are we just talking about news that we heard throughout the last 2 days?
No, we can keep going.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the next.
Unrestricted housing, a lot of the housing for low income or means there's all sorts of hoops. You can't have this on your criminal record, you can't have bad credit, you can't have, there's all sorts of really high restrictions. And next thing you know, that's a huge amount of the population that you're leaving out. As well as you can't have your kids come stay with you if they start going broke and they can't move back in with you if you're in public housing. Unless you go through some hoops and get stuff. Or if there's a lot of restrictions we put on people who are poor that we don't put on people who can afford their own homes. Which then nullifies the social integration and makes people feel like they're not worthy people.
One of the things, and this is maybe a little off the track, or maybe it fits here, that I was thinking about, there was some discussion about, we have a big building and we put in this big building, $1 million condos and also affordable housing. So it's integrated, I suppose you would call that. Is that what people want?
Some do. I mean, that issue's, I don't speak,
I was
Kathy can
writing
speak to
something
that better
down.
than I can.
Could you reiterate that, please?
Well, I'm just saying that the people, if you take somebody who can afford a low-cost apartment, and we have a place for that apartment in a building that has 80% expensive apartments or condos, is that where they want to be?
And that's a challenging discussion. I think Sunshine could talk about that too. I think there's a concern about what we've been hearing is called cultural displacement. That mixed income needs to be done very sensitively and in conjunction with the residents who are currently here, and they are part of the decision-making process. So I think that's all I can really say, that it's not an all or nothing proposition. It's about treating everybody like with respect and hearing everyone's side of the story and explaining that the market rate units will do this for you, for your community. But what we have heard is the need for that middle tier housing, because housing alone does not end poverty. We want mobility and people moving up out of the lower levels of income need other tiers of housing to move into, which we simply do not have.
It's also not about just the building, it's about what's around the building, and that answers part of the question. If you're doing this in a context of this big monolith outside of anything, that's one thing, but if somebody in that context can walk to this and have access to their job, have access to transit, their child can go to the charter school and these kinds of, and the park right in that same area, that's a very different equation. And what is so different about that from the people in the $1 million condos? They all desire those same things, and if you're gonna have a real community, you need both of those entities in that community. Why can't they live together in some way? I'm not saying it has to be the big building, as Kathy says, there's lots of different options of how that may be practiced.
I think that's the key word, options. We need to look at who needs housing that is affordable, what kind of family structures they have, what kind of lifestyles they would like. And some would love to have a townhouse with a yard for the kids. Others might appreciate an urban lifestyle. And so I think Rick had it just right. Some might really like to live in a mixed income building right downtown, but not all.
Hinging off what Kathy just said, the question of mixed income needs to extend beyond that conversation just being on the backs of low-income communities. It needs to be in the context of how Grant Duffield put it so strongly, which is deconcentrating affluence as well. It has to be not just about deconcentrating poverty, it has to be on the other side of the equation. We have to talk about knitting the city together on all fronts. And that's a really hard conversation we're gonna have to confront as a city, particularly on the planning commission as we look at the comprehensive plan and what structure we put in place to facilitate that.
I would like to extend that to the county as well.
Thank you, yes, thank you, yes.
And I think there's when you talk about redevelopment versus preservation of existing communities versus new development, it makes a difference. I think the real challenge is in redevelopment scenarios if you're gonna talk to mixed income, because that's where I think you're talking about changing an entire community, displacing people's community as they know it, displacing people. Versus if you're building some new development on the fringe, and you might wanna include a number of units, 20-25% or whatever. But I think it really makes a difference whether you're talking redevelopment, new development, or just trying to preserve communities the way they are.
I do think if we look at a model for effective affordable housing that is cross-income and cross-class, caste, religion, ethnicity, you have to look at a place like London. And what triggered that was you had a consistency of a national government by policy that was determined to alter the landscape for housing for working class people in London because they were essential to the performance of that economy. And we have case history here with Vinegar Hill where there was an effort and another location, Society Hill in Philadelphia, many cases throughout the country where poor people, their land was basically taken away from them like they were living on an Indian land, and in came the cavalry and it was seized and turned over to the cattlemen, and it was redeveloped. And the temptation was certainly to generate more money, but what happened to the culture? Pam brings up this displacement issue. I wish somebody from Habitat were here to talk about Southwood.
We have Habitat.
Okay, good. Because the conundrum is how much mixed new people do you put together when you have an existing community, low-income community with a lot of cultural norms and a sense of real community feel that is based on the origin of these people coming from the outside. How much of that do you change if you just took all of those people and put them into high income neighborhoods, you would destroy the whole organic social solidarity that exists in that community. You would destroy the community from the standpoint you're arguing, you're helping the family move up because you're giving them better housing. And it's easy to justify that, especially from a Judeo-Christian creed approach, but is that good social policy? I don't think it's good social policy at all. It's rather counterproductive. So it's trying to get that happy medium there of getting that increased number of new people together with opportunities for additional affordable units, at the same time preserving the culture and the norms by which people have lived. Very, very delicate balance to do that.
Does that imply that we need to think about what kind of community we want? Is that clear?
Well, I don't. I think it might be helpful to identify some time constraints of what the goals are for immediate need versus what might be 3, 10, 20, 40 years into the future.
But what do you plan for? You have to plan out over the future. You can't just plan for immediately, especially if you're looking at economic redevelopment of a community.
What I meant was to identify a need for immediate needs as being a separate conversation in addition to longer term goals.
It was interesting. As an outsider, I had that feeling as we were talking about needs is, my gosh, what can we do now? That could make an impact. I think that would be something that's important to think about.
And I think the piece of what, I wanted to ask a question. So I'm here from Boulder. We're not you, we're different. We have experience with different things. And we have a lot of experience with mixed income, so I'm curious if you'd like to hear about ours. Our program has probably been 20, 25 years where we've been mixing income, so we have some of the other under adults. And so you have to separate rental from home ownership, number one. The two products are really different and they act very differently. And in home ownership, so we have found mixing income works pretty good. There are only two circumstances where it's pretty problematic and typically we don't do it very much. One is with really high-end luxury housing for sale. You have HOA fees and assessments that the affordable owners can't handle, and they don't have enough, there aren't enough of them to have any crowd on the HOA board, and that can be a problem. There is a cultural divide where nobody's comfortable. I have to tell you, that's just been our experience. We don't actually have a ton of experience because we don't do a lot of it. High income luxury for sale product, our world gets to pay lots of money to the city to do other things. In the rental world though, you don't see a ton of high end rentals, and when you do see them, they're mixed in one project. You'll have the ones on the top floor, the penthouse rental units that are very expensive, and then you typically do actually have a bunch of different incomes in a rental project. And it works pretty well. You don't have HOA fees to deal with. The population's kind of, it's not permanent. Obviously you want to live there for a long time, but it's just not the same model. So we find that works really well. And in the rental model, so all the workforce, kind of rental projects that just aren't like hugely luxury, integrate just fine. Where it doesn't work is if the rental development is targeted toward students in our world. Mixing low-income families with a bunch of student project also doesn't work, so we kind of avoid that one. So that's our experience for what it's worth.
Before you release the floor, could you tell us a little bit about how Holiday, because Holiday seems to like a really successful development. Could you tell us how that started? Was that the first one in Boulder?
Holiday was a public-private partnership, so it's a little bit different than some of the other stuff that we've done, which is a lot of through inclusionary housing. And then a lot of just pure, we bring in money from a lot of different sources and we fund it out to the housing authority to build affordable rentals all over the city. But Holiday was a big mixture of a lot of things. And it was a very large piece of property, I don't remember how many acres, but it was pretty big. And so it was the last big undeveloped piece of property in the city of Boulder. It's called Holiday because there was a drive-in theater called Holiday Theater on the property. So the Housing Authority bought it with some local funds, with federal funds. Where the money comes from is really important to how these things play out. And then they kind of did a competition to all the local architecture firms, and they said, we want to create this mixed income, mixed type, really walkable, get out of your car, mixed use, like some retail and some housing together neighborhood. We want to create this, this model. And essentially, a lot of the architecture services were donated, so that helped a lot. It was a competition, and I'll have to tell you, they got their money's worth because that thing's in the paper. It's out there in the world all the time. It's being held up as a great project, so they get a lot of PR out of it. But it just came down to the fact that we had money and we had a vision. It takes money. You have to find your funding sources to do this type of thing. And so it ended up with, I think, 45% affordability. There's rentals, there's for sale units, there's townhomes, there's duplexes, single families, stacked flats, there's mixed use with, so it's a really, really successful project, and it was very expensive. But a key to it was we got a good deal on the property early on.
Excuse me, could you go and
Certainly
join
makes
the
the
circle
income
as a chair in the future? Could we, or enlarge the circle a bit? There's no escape.
Thank you for tidying in with that.
I just wanted to make one point. I think one of the critical needs that is not reflected on this list, although it was mentioned under the social integration by knowing the population, is the community engagement aspect and really listening, truly listening to those in need of housing and of better life opportunities. And it's not just about the current needs, as we've touched on here, but about where do those in critical need of housing, who are the very lowest income populations at this point, where do they want to go from here? So and Catherine mentioned this about having the middle income or middle tier of housing. We need those tiers. We don't want that income stratification of extremely $1 million condos alongside extremely low income, because then we miss that middle tier, like you mentioned, and that's when we get a community that cannot be cohesive and cannot be sustainable. So we really need to understand what the needs of our most vulnerable neighbors truly are, but also what their aspirations are. Where do they want to go? What do they want for their children in not just 5 years, but 20, 30, 40. And many of them have been in this community for generations and otherwise would be displaced and their families would be displaced if we don't have options for them many years into the future. But that starts with really understanding their aspirations and hopes. And so, yes, rental versus homeownership is an important distinction to make, but you can't just put someone in a rental forever and expect that they're just going to stay in this community. You also need steps to better housing options. You need economic mobility. And what I think we really need to avoid is that extreme income social stratification. And just a little background, I moved here recently and I lived in New York City for a long time. Charlottesville does not want to become what I saw that become over many, many years there, which is an extremely stratified population where you have, on one hand, it's a playground for the extremely wealthy, and on the other hand, it has a horrible homeless crisis that is, you have the wealthiest and poorest right next to one another, and that is not what we want for Charlottesville. We want a more sustainable community. But it starts with really listening. Can I
just suggest we push that just a little bit further? Again, I'm from Park City, and this is not knowledge from Park City, because Park City, I'm speaking from my former job. I worked for Macaulay Institute, which was a national nonprofit working around the country. And that is, the community engagement means people need to be at the table It's not me going in to someone's home and interviewing them. They need to be at the table, but I will say it is the longest time process to do that. It takes extreme patience, and it takes acknowledging that every one of us is gonna be uncomfortable at some point. And the outcome, many years down the road, is a completely different outcome than what you would expect it to be when you start. In Park City, we're struggling with this greatly right now because we are a resort community and we depend on a huge immigrant population to support our resort community, and they are not at the table. And we struggle and struggle and struggle, and we're still trying to work to get to stop speaking for them.
Well, one of the business, we have a saying that no business plan survives the first contact with a real customer. We're saying, develop these plans, they all good techniques for that, and then we take it out and say, well, that doesn't work for me. Yeah.
In our discussion so far, it seemed, and this comes off of sort of Annie's comment, is we've been discussing fixing a problem. And we've just been discussing how we can help them. And I wonder whether one of the biggest challenges that we have is flipping that understanding and not thinking about problems that need to be fixed, but assets that can be maximized. Because when you go into different communities, each community has, when we talk about the kind of existing relationships and existing patterns in a community, that's a whole series of assets that community has. And so we're trying to figure out how to mix people together when one of them is a problem and one of them is a solution. And who wants to live next to a problem to be fixed? And who wants to live next to somebody that wants to fix you? And so I think there's a kind of flipping of the way that we think in terms of, boy, what can we learn? What kind of assets? What kind of culture? What kind of benefit is there in bringing resources? And I'm not just talking about financial resources. I'm thinking about resources of political influence, resources of business, resources of development, and resources of sort of connecting people to each other so that we can, when you say bring them to the table, you don't want to come to the table as the problem that gets fixed and that we're successful when we figured out a solution for you. Yeah. I think it's really a flipping of how we think about the whole problems and what we do with the assets that we have.
Well, that is sort of an opening part observation I had. There were, maybe, I'm not sure I have the exact count, either 3 or 4 African Americans in our sessions. All except Charlene were from out of town.
I'm African American.
Out of town. No, it was the place, he was out of town.
Out of town.
Oh, yeah, it was a little odd placement of the out of town.
It's still pretty early.
It would be on that stage.
But it's also really uncomfortable for one person to be in the room and have to stand in for some category of people.
Absolutely, sure. But the thing I was thinking about is that this is a long-term issue. But if we're going to, we need to include not just in bringing people in as part of the customer set, but as part of all our organizations. And so how do we develop people who understand planning and technology and all the things that we do in your professional work? Actually having the people that we're calling customers be part of the process and the professionalism to try to solve the problem. Yeah.
I have ideas on that.
All right. And we're just going to have to drive to the next page.
One, engage the churches
Hold on just a second.
to help bring notification
use that outreach as part of, talk to, you know, come and talk to churches about coming and presenting at different times about what is going on, how to be involved, and asking people then and there, like, what are the barriers, going around knocking on people's doors and saying, what are the barriers to come to these meetings? Do you want to come to these meetings? Is there a better way to contact you? Do you want it online, do you want it, going, and then also going to the soup kitchens, going to the Haven and talking there, going to like all the places we're talking about targeting and saying, and doing one-on-one, and there's people who would volunteer to do that, just like they would canvass for politics and stuff. Having tables at local festivals, every single festival there is, getting a table and having a city official sitting there, answering questions, taking data, saying, do you have concerns? Do you have, make sure that every single one of those is being represented.
Well, I guess, I have to admit that having experience in the corporate world, when we were looking at affirmative action, we realized that in the recruiting process, that we had to overtly ask the question about, are we getting broad enough candidates for this? Yes.
This seems like a good time to bring up the 3 points that came out of my session.
Right.
That was on community engagement.
Yeah.
We're talking about that. The 3 takeaways as the moderator, I'm sure you all can chime in if you were there. I think trust and relationship building is key to engagement, in any kind of engagement. And so if you're not doing some of those things that Tina's talking about, where you go out to folks and you seek their input, and that's part of getting into the second point of involving folks from the beginning. Don't develop an idea and then go out and then say, what do you think about this? Everybody needs to be at the table from the start. And then the third point was, and there were so many different pieces off of this, it was just communication in general. How are you reaching out to folks? Are they given options for accessibility? I love that idea you brought up yesterday about, it's a different version of how we do our town hall here, where you just set up with staff all over the place and then you come in when you have time and engage with government staff. And you do it in their neighborhoods and you make yourself as accessible as possible. But the communication and how we reach out to people and how they reach out to us, and I'm speaking as a city employee, and that would be in any kind of service provider agency who has the responsibility of engagement. How are you making yourselves accessible? How are you reaching out to folks? Don't assume that everybody has a smartphone and can, access the web through their phone, or has cable and can access, important meetings through watching cable, because that's how, you stream your meetings. We gotta really think differently about the whole communication piece. And I think off of all those 3 points, there were lots of other very important things that were said, but I think that sort of provides a graph.
Thank you.
Real quick illustration of something like that locally. A representative from Piedmont Virginia Community College has made a habit of going to grocery stores and other big employers and sitting all day in the waiting room, in the break room, so that workers could talk with her during their 15 and 30-minute breaks about starting to go to college at the college.
Yes.
This may be unpopular to say, but
looking around this room, I don't see very many private developers or landowners here. And I'm gonna suggest to you that some of those same three things that the community needs are the same things that they're looking for.
And building off of that, so thank you for bringing that up. We've been talking a lot in here about how we can go, and Sunshine's gonna say I'm getting signed for a fact here. About how to engage the well communities, the people that need the housing the most and what they want, which I think is incredibly important, so don't get me wrong here. But there's not a lot of discussion in here on how we're going to reach the high wealth communities, the white communities sitting off in their own little single family home enclaves, and getting them to understand why what we're trying to do, all of this is important. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle that we're missing. They need to come to the table to understand as much as we do.
Yeah, if I could define that a little, the way I've looked at it is a broad base of community support. And that ties back to the funding question. At some point, sooner or later, those are the people you're asking to pay for this. And those of you who've been in this community know the county in the one. Know there's a supervisor who said, it's just a pizza and a beer a month. It turned the board in the next election because there was not community support and there was a backlash, there was a reaction. We have to build that broad base of community support, or we're just going to start the pendulum moving back and forth.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. So far what I've heard are a lot of, it can be difficult, there's a lot of general thoughts. I wonder to what degree we understand a specific problem that exists, who needs affordable housing, and what the differences between, if there is one in this community, between low-income housing and affordable housing. And to give an example, based on a couple points I've heard, to the New York income stratification issue. I lived in Santa Barbara, California for a while. That community faced a real issue when the mudslides closed Highway 101 back in 2004 or 5, and they suddenly realized that hardly any of their firefighters, policemen, or service providers lived in the county, let alone the city. So that became a real focus issue of this isn't, to your point, this is an asset. These people are an asset to the community, and we need them to have the choice to live in this community. So that was one example. And I also lived in parts of LA and saw artists creating vibrant communities of live workspaces being driven out. So there's an asset that's creating economic development, and then they can't find affordable housing. So that's a separate issue from low-income housing. And I'm fairly new to this community, but I just am thinking that the overlay in some ways should be dictated by what the definable issues are. And I haven't heard many in the few times this has come up through the week. I haven't heard many tangible, definable stories that can galvanize opinion or traction or interest in solving a specific problem or protecting a specific asset.
Does that have to do with urgency as well? I mean, if you have a mudslide that closes off the community, then there's
that's an extreme example, but I mean, I'm sure that there are people who live here much longer than I who can see or who know of a social issue that's being exacerbated by the lack of affordable housing. Well, homelessness is not.
I would say domestic violence, domestic violence, poverty and domestic violence, and not having a safe, stable community that supports neighbors allows for some uneasy situations that would be prevented if there weren't so much concern over money about the house and other things. There might be a link there, I haven't asked about it or talked about it, but often the women who go to the women's shelter don't have much to do, they don't have much neighborhood support or family support or financial support, and they need support in the women's shelter to get financially able to have a home with their children, and that's really quite relevant here, although the numbers of people may be few, there is a deep urgent need there.
Yes.
I was just gonna suggest we also hear from the finance workshop, it seems like at least a couple of the comments made.
Going to go around with all six, hopefully.
Can I insert, before we get to that point though, can I insert, I wanna hinge off of what Stacy and Charlene talked about a moment ago, which is that some of this conversation around the communication piece in particular has been mirrored in the last couple of meetings we've had. So the HAC, the Housing Advisory Committee, recently kind of created a couple of new subcommittees. One of them is the Strategic Planning Subcommittee, which I chair, which is working with Stacy and other folks. What's our strategy? What's our process by which to get to our strategic plan, affordable housing strategic planning plan, essentially. And where we are right now is talking about communication, is how do we build that? And the other subcommittee is the communication subcommittee, and so we've actually come together, we realized we need to come together as a singular committee, at least in the short term, while we get through this process. So a lot of these conversations are mirroring there, so just as a point of information, for those folks who want to continue to participate in that after this is done, we will continue to have those meetings and continue to have that dialogue. And a lot of what we're talking about, in terms of going to grocery stores or going to workplaces, what we're doing right now is actually building what we think is going to be a budget that we need to put in front of council to actually do this process well. And that part of our pitch will be trying to have funding so we can hire and train folks from the low wealth community to be part of the process of communicating and spreading the word and engaging the community.
I need to slip in here because this is a perfect example of how departments and advisory groups within local government are in silos. The Place Design Task Force has a subcommittee on engagement. I have been trying repeatedly to get the Place Design Task Force and the HAC Advisory Committee together for work sessions. It doesn't happen. So I'm just saying that there's a chronic issue of inertia moving forward because people are comfortable in their own groups. HAC is comfortable with HAC. Place which design is all about the physical aspects of placemaking. They cannot be mutually exclusive. So I'm glad I'm here just for this. I just want to, that is a problem. That is an observation.
We need
You're in
another
silence.
committee to go to their work.
Yeah. Well, and then you do wonder, well, we are a city with a very active community. We have advisory groups up the wazoo. And so then it winds up being a management issue.
Well, the other thing I was going to bring up about that is the idea of mindsets. We all come with a mindset. And if you're working in this field, there's a mindset that goes with it. But the people that you're trying to engage, and I had a little trouble with that term, they have a different mindset. And sometimes that is a fundamental aspect of communication. So what you're describing is each of these subsets comes with their own mindset.
Yeah.
And so one of the things you have to do is sort of figure out a way to break out of that. Where's that mindset come from? Well, it's all the messages that we're given through our lives and our professional development. Other people don't have the same. And particularly we usually think about in coaching positive messages and negative messages. And I would guess that most of us in the room grew up with a lot of positive messages. If you got through college, you got a master's degree or whatever, there were positive messages that drove you down that track. But if you're a person who received mostly negative messages, you might be able to be a nurse, but you can't be a doctor, or you can work in a post office, but you can't be an engineer, then that's a negative mindset that is difficult to change. And so the communication issue is, I think, a huge issue to think about, and part of that is self-examination. Where am I coming from? Can I be open to other points of view? And the best way to change that is nose to nose. Go to the regular. Yes.
So, I have been sitting in a lot of these committee meetings and a lot of these city council meetings for a while. And coming from a representative of a property owner in town who happens to have property right dead center in the middle of all of this area we're talking about. One of the frustrations that we feel, and you will notice Mr. Kuttner left the room. One of the frustrations that I think we feel is we hear a lot of the same conversation happening amongst the same group of people, all of whom in this room care a lot about the end result. What I had really hoped that we would see, and what I thought we were going to see this week, is to have some of those communities in Boulder, in Park City, wherever, who have done this right and come to the table and said, this is how we did it. This is what the private developer did, this is what the city did, this is how we engaged the community, this is where the amenities were located, this is where the transportation was located. We really wanted to dig in to some success models. And I've not ever been to one of these meetings where anybody really dug in to the success model.
Well, perhaps we need to build a success model here in Charlottesville and Albemarle, because does that perfect model exist of other places in the country and is perfectly replicable here? Probably not, but yes, we can learn from Boulder and we can learn from Park City, but we have to create that model here in this particular context. And you're exactly right, that starts here. We need to bring all parties to the table, whether it's private developers and low-income communities, but I don't think a perfect model actually does exist, and so what can we do to build something that is perfect for this community? And I think Sunshine touched on this when he said hiring people from the community to actually do this work and do the community engagement work. We talked about breaking down, barriers of like transportation, childcare, et cetera. There are a lot of pressures on people's time already, on very low-income people's time already. And part of that community building and that trust building, that relationship building that's asking for more time, more of their time. And time is money when you have a single mother working multiple jobs. So at various hours of the day. So if we are truly committed to building that successful model, we need to actually be financially empowering low-income community members by paying them to do this work and to doing it right and building that very successful model. And yes, that takes a lot of money and time, but if we're actually committed to it, then we should be allocating those resources from whether it's private developers, city, money, whatever that is.
I have a question for the group. I mean, should we not build one more unit of affordable housing until we get the community engagement right?
I think you have to do the opposite. I think you have to do, we can't let perfection be the enemy of the.
So I just want to say that because we're talking about, I think Rachel made a good point, is near, mid, and long term here. Because on my dais where I sit, I'm hearing units. We gotta get them built.
Well, I'll just write that song, it'll go like that. Units.
And there's a difference between redevelopment of an established community and building on a gray field site that's currently a parking lot that needs to be improved. There's different things going on in the city that we can do. And when we're interfacing with an established community, absolutely, we've got to rethink, self-examine, make sure we are engaged and inclusive. But there's also the need for the units.
And in that right now, talking about sort of the challenges that we face, typically one of the biggest obstacles we have, as Mark and other people alluded to, is there's a lot of obstacles preventing us from doing things that we know we need to do. But when you're building something in the middle of a parking lot, there's a lot less pushback against that. I mean, there still is pushback against it.
Yeah.
Make no mistake, this is Albemarle County, Charlotte.
No,
It's true, but there is the opportunity to act now because we've got development applications, and if you could, it's not gonna solve everything, but if you can seize that moment, you actually can get those units now, but you have to commit to go all the way through, and you have to commit to say what because obviously we saw the financing piece yesterday. Without that money, you're not going to get this to happen. So you have to commit now to just add on to make sure this happens in that. when you do that, you can address transit-oriented development, because, you know, unlike Boulder, we don't have the transit network that they have going right now. So to your point, it's not quite, we don't have quite the same infrastructure. So, but you can start addressing all of those needs. It won't solve everything, but it will get the units now. So to your point, that you've got near term, you know, immediate term, and then there's midterm and long term. This all needs to happen, but we can't miss the right now because that's going by now. What happens when the next recession hits? We're not gonna get any of this.
Yes.
My personal goal in organizing this summit was to get units built now. We need to focus part of our energies on the redevelopment of some of our existing generation-old facilities, and that's very important. We need to figure out how to do that. Sometimes we're working very hard on this without destroying the sense of community in that. But we also need many, many more new units to begin to make an impact on the 1,000-person waiting list. And I think we need to figure out a way to do both. How does CRHA sort of create a new generation of housing for their existing, while at the same time, how do we create many more units? And the goal, in my mind, one of the actions is that can come out of this is we've identified several tools that can help in this effort. And we need to somehow identify the tools that, from a policy point of view and from a pragmatic design and construction point of view, most importantly from a funding point of view, can actually get units built. And I think there are lots of tools that are talked about. I mean, the earlier discussion, what do people really want to live in mixed income? Some do. And if I could create an apartment complex and I had 10 people off that list that were happily enjoying that sort of urban lifestyle of that particular project, well, that's a success. So yes, units now. Yes, a strategy for getting caught up on the situation that we find ourselves in the city with the generational units. I think we have to figure out how to do both. So let's build units.
So I guess the other piece of that also with regard to where the community is going, is it important that we show action now? Yes. And we aren't just talking.
I have an idea with that, and it really has to do with a lot of things I learned when I was working in the public schools as teacher's aide for special ed students and for just in the classroom. Taking the main ideas, writing them big, identifying which words are very much ones that we as a group will resonate with, and having positive, visionary kinds of encouraging words, words that build trust, words that give inspiration, really does help loads. So I would love to do little art projects or write things in colors or whatever, if you, for the next whatever sessions happen in this area. I know I want to be engaged in this in a longer term way. This weekend has been very inspirational to me, but the art and the music reaches people very much more directly and quickly, and I know that because for 3 years in my boring job in the grocery store, I've been quoting little poems and singing songs to people, and that's the thing that gets them really animated and coming back to the store I'm in. People tell me all the time it means something to them. They say it makes their day when they hear something that's real and relevant.
Yeah, I think, art and music is something I wrote down in my notes for this section, probably because you said it. Yes.
And I know that the city is much more than we are in the county. And I know one of the things I talked about right when I was going to be part of the finance session was trying to look at some tools that the county can use. And inclusionary zoning was one of the, I think, tools that was shared. We're not enabled in the state to do that, but the county at least is enabled to do an affordable dwelling unit or workforce dwelling unit ordinance. And I personally think that that's something that the county needs to really look at, because that would at least enable developments and applications that come through for us to talk about a percentage of units that could be dedicated for affordable housing. So an ADU, WDU ordinance for the county is a tool that I would like us to be looking at from a policy standpoint.
Okay. I wonder, I mean, when we think about the activity that's going on, we're taking on really difficult projects. Sunshine Friendship Court is the redevelopment of an existing neighborhood. That's an extraordinarily difficult, that's the most difficult thing to do. Here, we're gonna redevelop your neighborhood, what do you think? You know, that, and doing that differently is really difficult. CRHA is taking on a really difficult project. And I think coming off of something that Greg said, you know, maybe there's a way to identify a kind of dumb and simple kind of first thing. You know, you're starting to talk about it, about parking lots, and is there a way that while reinforcing all of this other work, is there some way to identify? Can we find the place in the city?
We do.
Yeah, and
The
have
city of Charlottesville has what they call designated small area plans. These are areas that are often underdeveloped, acres of asphalt. Hillsdale Hydraulic is one of them. And we're moving in that direction where we are going to be doing affordable housing there as part of our goal of that small area plan. But then with those small area plans, I would say we need to establish targets. Because if you don't have it, if you don't measure it, it won't happen. So, and we need the housing needs study though to know what those units are that we need to target. And
We
we're
have the same
getting
thing
that.
going on with Route 29, it's exactly
Yes.
what we're trying to do. But then I also point out, we don't yet have a viable transit system that's going to connect those people where, you know, to the community.
Well, the chicken
itself.
egg though, if you get the population centers
Totally,
in
but
place, it
yeah.
does start enabling that.
But so again, those are difficult problems. A small, how far off in a small area plan, how far off is real development and real building in that scenario? Could we identify a
Well,
place?
there's Cherry Avenue is underway now with a small area
With
plan.
development applications in front of us now.
So a small area plan is still big, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So one of the other actions was we're creating a land bank. So the city's identifying real sites that are underutilized or more, even easier, not in any active use. And so one of the actions can be for the city to make those available to the not-for-profits and other developers to create housing. So that's a really simple, short-term potential.
I guess one of the things I think that as we write down possible solutions, and again, I think we need to be a little careful about expanding it to make it more complicated. There was a thing that used to be on the radio, the man in the street interview, and that was, they didn't have women in the street in those days, I guess. But we'd go up and talk to people and say, "What's your job?" And I remember one that said, "What's your job?" The guy says, "I'm a complicator." And what is that? Well, just give me a problem and I can blow it up and make it more complicated. So, and I've always because like, don't we are complicated.
I think one of the things that it's not a specific immediate action, but I think it is something that can be done, again, to be looked at very quickly, is starting with communication and partnership. A concern I've got between Albemarle County and the city of Charlottesville, what made me think about it was the hydraulic small area plan. I mean, here's an area, it's 100 acres of paved parking sitting there, ready to be used for something, you know, more useful. What I don't want to see happen, and I have seen it happen in areas I've lived before, is when you have two localities with the same growth demand side by side, if they aren't on the same sheet, you're gonna have developers negotiating and choosing what fits them. And you don't want that to happen, that's not gonna be beneficial for anybody. Because for the citizen, they could care less pretty much which side of the jurisdictional boundary they're on. But getting Albemarle and Charlottesville to start to have their land use, regulations and other things in those areas mirroring each other.
That's, we're talking about form-based code overlay, and I think you are too, and then we're both jurisdictions are working together on that. Because the one thing we're not talking about is the quality of the place. We need to be very cognizant that when we ask the community where and how and what their future is, the quality of the place they live in matters to everybody, whether they're living in Greenbrier or whether they're living on South First Street. So it's not just units, it's the quality of place.
Yes, Rick.
Grant, I'd like to make one observation that the urgency factor, I think for a long period of time, the county and affordable housing were not synonymous terms. And we did rely, as many other more rural counties have, on coffers as an approach. And state legislature took that off the table. And I think Michelle's presentation especially was very informative about the fact that in Boulder, they don't have a single arrow in the quiver. They have a multiplicity of tools available that they can deploy using P3 partnerships, and along with their economic development authority. And we're finally now in the county at a point where the EDA is playing a role in affordable housing, as out in Old Lynchburg Road. And the board is also making a financial commitment to affordable housing, as in the case of Southwood. So there are forward steps being made in a county that its vestigial view of itself is still overwhelmingly rural in nature. Witness the rain tax issue, where the rural faction roared its disapproval. And meantime, the planned residential communities and the urban ring were silent over that. So the rural still has influence, even though politically they don't have the numbers anymore. But so we have to move very carefully. I think Mark's absolutely right. If you move too expeditiously, if we said tomorrow, we're starting a land bank and we're gonna mandate so many units of affordable housing, so we're sending the signal to the development community for support of it, probably half the board would be gone in 2 years as a result of that, because you're giving an opportunity for a political reaction. But you have to move expeditiously here. At the same time, you have to seize opportunities when they present themselves. And I think that's happening now, because I think that I have a personal stake in this, obviously as a supervisor, but I think this board gets it about a need for affordable housing. And the real problem, though, is where do the resources come from, because we're limited in what we can do. And we have a capital improvement plan that is strapped to the hilt with a multiplicity of demands on it. Schools, police, fire, and parks, recreation, across the board. So affordable housing is important, but we also get signals that the most important thing are trails. So you have to balance all of that. And I just think without the federal government being in the picture in a meaningful way, we're all going to continue to flounder. We can make an honest, good faith effort to make steps, limited steps that they are, but we're still going to flounder. We're never going to meet the demand need that is out there. And maybe that's just putting everything, kicking it upstairs. I think there's a will there on a local level, but we're just limited in terms of the quantity of resources.
Well, that raises the question I asked yesterday, I think, when we were talking about these. How important do we feel this problem is? How much are we willing to commit to this problem as compared to other things?
Since money's on the table, why don't we talk about the finance?
Sorry,
I think there's still an issue with, what is the problem? I mean, many of you have been studying this in town for a while in different towns, but as a citizen of Charlottesville who's read a lot about affordable housing, I honestly, and I work in the building design industry, so I know some of these terms and know something about it, but I would just say again, hone the story, because I don't know what the issue is in town. I've been here for 3 years, and you could say I'm not paying attention or I'm not absorbing the facts, but one thing over this week that many of the keynote speakers are just adept at are getting to the emotional core of an issue and galvanizing people's attention. And I'm just saying that with some of the terms in this room, you're not going to get people to give the valuable time. You're not going to get people to show up and say how it would impact their lives. You're not going to get people to feel an emotional resonance with their neighbor around what the need is for choice for someone to be able to live next to someone else when the issue is affordability. And what affordability even means. It's kind of a fuzzy box.
Can I just
And I'm just
respond to
saying
that
that-
as a person that's been on city council for 6 years and give you some background? I mean, I can, I don't have to, but about, in the last 2 years, our property assessments skyrocketed. I mean, 35% for commercial, 12% for residential. I can't remember the exact percentages, but that was the canary in the mine that we're part of a pattern of Americans coming back to cities. And before, this was like 2 years ago, before that, we had in place what we thought was a viable affordable housing strategy, which was using our special use permit process and our rezoning process as a way to kick in incentives for developers to either contribute to the housing fund, build affordable units on-site or build them off-site, because that was what our General Assembly allowed. In the last 2 years, the housing has become a very, very hot item because our land values are so high. We can't seem to build anything affordable. We don't have, all of our units exceed the HUD maximum rental, so that people with housing budgets can't even find a place to live in Charlottesville. We're looking at 80% of our city employees don't live in the city. 70-80% of the university employees don't live in the city. School teachers don't live in the city. So those are the indicators. And we did have a housing study called from the RCLCO completed in 2015 that told us we had 2 needs: high-end housing and very low-end housing. The high-end housing was because they were empty nesters, people that already paid off their mortgages, wanted to still stay in the city, but couldn't find housing that they wanted. It was gumming up the conveyor belt, if you will. So, ergo, we build up luxury units. And to get people wanting to live in the city, so they free up that, what would be family, middle-class housing. So I just want to give you some context. It's really new, and then we've got the housing needs assessment going on to give us some more exactitude.
This is perfect. When I see an article about West Second and there's 18 units that are affordable, none of that is in that.
I know.
So back to the communication issue.
We said it
That's what I'm
in the
talking
council
about.
meeting, but it doesn't get
When you have those facts, you have those determinations, communication, connection with people around us is to me missing.
So let me ask a slightly different question, sort of building on the action question. Could we make a commitment today that within the next 60 days, we will identify a viable project?
All right. Little Town makes this a lot easier. Scottsville is updating the comprehensive plan now. We recognize that our main economic development strategy is an affordable housing strategy. Those absolutely linked together. We have a stupid easy project like 1 and 60 acres of factory site that's vacant that we want to turn into mixed use at the same time. PHEA can finance it up to $50 million. These workshops have been super helpful for me as a new town administrator. We didn't know what the project plan was, to write it down, identify most of the stakeholders. Their comprehensive plan draft was the planning commission on May 7th. If you think this is important and have never been to Scottsville, come tell our planning commission that it is important.
That's good.
Want some other projects?
So could we write down on the action plan within the next 60 days, maybe I can even shorten that to 30, we could identify through Albemarle and Charlottesville coming together at least one major affordable housing project.
And mine would be like 50 affordable units. It's not a lot, but it's a lot for Scottsville.
CRHA, I don't know if they'll get it out in 60 days, but CRHA is going to issue an RFQ to invite the development community to work with them on several sites. I think the first site, the lowest lying fruit, is the totally vacant land that they have called the Levy site, which is Garrett Bridge. I don't think it is going to happen in the 60-day time frame, but that's real. Sunshine is, I think, 60 days away from sort of getting more public about the exciting plans for Sherman Friendship Park, which includes a couple of first phase buildings. So I would suggest that that's another real step forward. Brenda?
Yes.
Redevelopment manager?
The RFQ will be released by Housing Authority within 60 days.
It won't, but 60 days from now, we won't know what real project, if the RFP is still, let's partner and let's define where we start and what it's for and who it's for. That's the only reason I qualify. And I think that's a good approach, by the way. Let's get a partnership and let's look at the big picture and decide how best to start. But you know, if you were saying you're going to put in an RFP and we want 100 units on the Levy site, that would be 60 days.
And how will that be communicated to the public?
I would like to ask, is there a diagram, I'm very visual, is there a diagram of who, I don't even know the vocabulary, which groups of people are involved in this kind of project in this area? Is there a diagram that shows who they are and what they do? It's like just kind of laid out, like I'm imagining a poster like this big, sometimes you see a presentation someplace, that just says what the different groups of interested people are and who they serve and what their main objective is and what they're able to do. Is there something like that? If there isn't, I'd like to do it by hand with Sharpies on a big piece of paper.
It's sort of in draft form, but we should talk.
Great, I didn't know who to ask, so you come tell me later.
So that's Chuck. Phase one.
I have one observation. There is an actor that is critical in this discussion that's not in this room. And that's the 800 pound gorilla at the University of Virginia. And as the principal landowner of property that's on the periphery of, that's really on the edge of the county and the city, could play absolutely an instrumental role in ensuring that there would be housing available for workers who currently commute 2 counties away in adjoining to Albemarle County and beyond to come to work at UVA Hospital and other parts of the university. That though there would be a higher cost of living here, some of them, again, might find it attractive, it wouldn't be everyone. But the university is a very important part of this conversation. So hopefully we're poised with the new president coming in, there can be a party to that conversation about what role can UVA play with the city and the county in addressing affordable housing.
Right, can I have a minute that? The university is the biggest generator of the need for workforce housing in our region. It's probably the biggest consumer of affordable units as well in the student body, and the deliberate policy current and past, of the university to actually not accommodate most of its students on the grounds. So they, and they're also probably the biggest landowner in the areas where this housing wants to be. So they are the biggest generator of the issues, and I think they have the most resources to solve the issues. We are working at trying to have them at the table, and you're right, they are not here.
One of the things that it was in my notes as I was sort of listening across all, the question of the diagram of who's involved. The next question for me would be, what's the process that we have to go through? It goes back to that, what did we learn from the case studies? And fundamentally, that is, what's the process that works? I think we heard some good examples from Habitat about their policy, their approach in including people and training them to be part of the process as we go along. But the other element is, so this is maybe because of things I work in, but where's the integrated place that I can go to see what's going on? What land is available? What's the list of all the financing options we have? Who are the contact people? What are the projects that are ongoing in this area? Those sorts of things. Now I can go to the Albemarle County's website and find some stuff down in planning things, or I can go to Charlottesville, or I can go to UVA, and I can find bits and pieces of these. And the same thing about the user data we were talking about. There are indicators out there in the real estate business and various other elements that can give us some feeling of what's going on in real time if we collect them all. But there's bits and pieces spread among all of you guys and more outside of you.
We need an urban institute.
Yeah, so something that says, do we care enough about this to bring all the information together? So another question.
But to Rick's point earlier, it is important to recognize that there are differences depending on where you are. There are certain places where you want to tout the fact that you've been successful with integrating affordable housing into it. In other places, even though you can do it and do a great job with it, you do not want to tout that because that will be the surest way to scuttle any progress forward, given sort of the narrative of that area. It's very different. It's unique to not just Charlottesville, Albemarle, different areas are different. So I want to be cautious that when you package a narrative, you have to be sensitive to that.
And I would suggest that we had a place where we had case studies with some outline of that case and who to contact for more information might be done.
Well, I don't want to give Chip and Christine, wherever she ran to, more work, but years ago I was in Washington DC area, worked for the Council of Governments. And that was my job, was to collect the data for the region that dealt with affordable housing, what the different jurisdictions were doing, and we were sort of the clearinghouse of that information. So it was disconnected for any particular government entity. It made it more neutral, and that was the place that everyone would go to get that information.
Well, this is a good idea, because we have a regional transit partnership right now that is between the city and the county, and we're doing the exact same thing that you just said about all things related to public transportation. We need a regional housing partnership. And Chip, it's looking like you're the problem.
Imagine that.
But on that note though, I think if you have separate partnerships, you run the risk of siloization again. And so one of the things that Austin did in the last 2 years was develop a housing and transportation jobs task force.
Oh, cool.
That looks at it comprehensively.
Cool. Absolutely.
Because you can't separate each of those issues.
Like how do you
people want
so
to
bad. Okay, they had me do something. Go ahead.
Sorry. One idea that I was really struck by was what Pasadena was doing with the ADUs. In taking, I don't know where this fits, I just haven't heard it being brought up. and how it can assist people who are struggling to keep their place.